Carolyn Eselin served as the costume designer on Barry Jenkins' 10-episode limited series, The Underground Railroad. I'm Luca Giliberti, contributing writer at Gold Derby, joined today by Carolyn. Carolyn, this is your third collaboration with Barry since you were also the costume designer on his past two feature films, Moonlight and If Beale Street Could Talk. How is it for you now diving with him into this grand 10-episode television journey?
Well, there's been a progression with our work as far as scope. Moonlight being such a small movie, we did it with nothing. Beale Street was, the scope was bigger and a deeper period. And then we went, huge. We kind of multiplied by, I don't know, 10 or 20, in everything. Even more than that. So the scope has gotten bigger, but being with Barry is just the same. It's just as a close collaboration. He's so accessible. It feels in a wonderful way, very small, because Barry's just so real and such a wonderful person and wonderful, collaborator. And so even though there's all this big stuff, or, there was all this even bigger stuff and bigger scope, it's still, it was comforting because you're with Barry and it's still that's sort of the same.
Absolutely. And you already mentioned the grand scope of this show. And what's really characteristic of the Underground Railroad, which is based on Colson Whitehead's novel of the same name, is that each chapter and thus each episode really is so distinctive and requires its own world building. How is it for you then being tasked with displaying or creating such variety in your work on this show?
It was there on the page. It was there in the script. It was there in the book. And, it was kind of, all those things are such wonderful guides. It's then getting together with, all the collaborators, with Mark Friedberg, with James Laxton, with Donnie, makeup, with Lawrence, hair, with Dottie, visual effects. It's just getting all of our heads together and sharing information and sharing imagery and sharing, all of our design and inspiration and everything that, we have, just sort of getting together to make sure, per episode that we were all together. Mm-hmm. And we took it, episode by episode. There was the through line is Cora, obviously, but she adapts to she is forced to adapt to her environments. She is the product of her environments constantly. And so she was also our guide all the way through in a way, but each episode and each state that Cora gets to sort of dictates what we needed to do. Mm-hmm. It's the optimism, the fake optimism of South Carolina, the mm-hmm. dark, wicked, terrible, horrible world of North Carolina, the burned out world of Tennessee, and then Indiana with its, sort of freedom and also real optimism and something the ease and beauty of Indiana, like all that was sort of there. And then we just sort of created around those feelings.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And the story itself is set in 1850, but is not, in fact, specific to that time period or that era in terms of the themes it explores, which is reflected in so many of the designs of the show, including the costume design. How did you decide when something was going to be more, I guess, in accordance with the look of 1850 and when you were going to deviate from it?
Well, that was also, we had a really, I feel like we could have prepped the Underground Railroad for a year, but we had 6 months and to prep. And those first couple of months, it was always research, yeah. And we were deep in research the whole way through. But those first couple of months, we really were trying to sleuth out what Colson Whitehead did in the book and what he was sort of referencing. And so there were, we knew 1850, but there were lots of cues within the story of sort of where we needed to be. I mean, Cora gets to South Carolina and it's elevators and skyscrapers. And so, naturally we sort of, and we really kicked some things around. Like we almost jumped up to the 1950s, like sort of small town, Jim Crow era, South, 1950. But so we had that time to sort of develop and really try out things. I mean, we were putting we tried 1950s fedoras with, and men's hats with 1880s suits, or we would do, we would try to sort of hybrid and meld those periods together. It ended up being that those hemlines would have been too jarring and would have taken you out. It almost would have been to me, it would almost been too gimmicky if we jumped that far. We needed to keep sort of back in the 1800s. And it just naturally went that we needed to be in the 1880s because that was just sort of naturally told in the story as well. And the 1830s in North Carolina was really taken from a novel by Harriet Jacobs that was Incidents of a Slave Girl. And so Colson White had referenced her and referenced that biography, and we backed those dates out. It was really a lot of sleuthing out. We figured out that story, she was in the attic for 7 years in the 1830s. So it was naturally so. And then it kind of gave us this amazing sort of, the 1830s were a wild time in costume and in clothing anyway. So it kind of really lent itself to sort of the look that we went for. There were other periods that were naturally given to us, like the origin story of Ridgway, or back to 1824 when he was a young man. But we knew sort of our base was 1850s, and Ridgway's, when we traveled, when Ridgway gets Cora again, and we head to Tennessee, we were very rooted in reality, and we were grounded in 1850s in Ridgway's world, 1850s. So that just all sort of made sense. But to answer your question, it was like we did a lot of work to try to figure out what periods we needed to be in. And we did end up doing hybrid periods, or marrying periods together. Like in Indiana, we kept our white population in 1850s, and then we put our Black population in the future. So because it's a progressive society. So we did things like that as well too. So although on the farm we had people coming from, the idea was that they would come from other places, like other people came from 1850s, come new to the farm, but eventually sort of end up in 1880s. And to turn of the century, we kind of, we gave ourselves like 20 years of, in their costumes, a progressive, sort of they could be more in the future, but kept our white population in 1850s.
That's incredibly fascinating. And in your research, did you ever run into any difficulties? When I spoke to Lawrence Davis, the hair department head, he said that because a lot of the images from back then were in black and white, he wasn't able to decipher some of the details on these photos. So I'm curious whether you ran into similar issues or difficulties while conducting your research.
I think when we didn't find something that we needed, we would then find a painting. We would then find, a piece of art. We would find, obviously we went back to periods where photos don't exist. So we looked at a lot of paintings and etchings and drawings and slave bulletins and anything that we could sort of get our hands on to get other further sort of reference of what clothing they would be wearing. We read all kinds of, and a lot of, it's a lot of reading as well.
Oh yeah.
And sometimes even like the slave bulletins would have a description of who they were looking for, what they were wearing, so that gave us another depiction idea. But we looked at everything. Wow. We looked at everything. I bought every book that we use. I have an amazing collection now, even more so of books added to my library because of Underground Railroad.
Well, the research really shows in the work which is so detailed and so incredible. And I guess with costume design, you always could run the risk of ending up distracting from the story or taking the viewers out of it. But I know that on the Underground Railroad, there was an emphasis on the importance of the costume design being rather subtle, if not partly invisible. How did you manage to do that? And was there ever a time when that was especially challenging for you?
I think, you know, and that's so true. We really, and thank you for pointing that out. We really wanted to. I think we stayed away from a lot of shiny fabrics. Every now and then you'll see it in a men's cravat.
Mm-hmm.
And especially like in South Carolina where, you know, okay, that was okay. But we really did. The story's so big and the story's so, like, we're already in other periods, and it I didn't want it to take away from the story and her journey. So where costumes did get big was in South Carolina. It was probably, you know, that South Carolina episode is our most conceptual, I think, as far as building from the ground up. You can't really, we built North Carolina from the ground up too, and we built a lot of Indiana, but it's you can't see it so much. North Carolina is so dark, but there is a whole concept behind North Carolina. But where you really see it is in South Carolina, and it just kind of had to be so. We had to go from a horrific plantation to this newfound optimism in South Carolina, or this, you know, fake sort of optimism. So that's where we leaned more into, you know, bigger costumes. But the rest all the way through, I just hope they were quiet and just, you know, help serve the story.
And of course, the story itself follows Cora and her journey out of slavery and toward the possession of her personhood. How did you manage to reflect her physical and emotional journey throughout the show in the costume design?
I think that the story, it was on the page, kind of helped to guide us too. I mean, what she goes through in the story is, you know, pretty horrific. We needed the clothes to tell that story and tell that journey. I mean, from leaving Georgia and escaping the plantation, that final field dress that she leaves in, how that what that dress goes through when she travels through the swamp. You know, it had to have the right water level on it as they went through the swamp. You know, we had like 10 of those dresses to help tell that story. And then, you know, naturally so, given the dress in South Carolina and the clothing that's sort of prison issued to them in South Carolina, that's just naturally so in the story, pardon me. Then North Carolina, when she gets to North Carolina, she's again issued new clothes. She's given the Wells daughters hand-me-downs that are in the attic. And so they're more childlike dresses. They're teenager dresses. That's what just they have. Of course, they've got Grace in the attic, and it's probably Jane's, you know, youngest dress that Grace has on. And then the other dresses they have in the attic, Cora wears. And that sort of really lent itself to when Cora walks out of the house and gives herself up to Ridgway, that it was kind of childlike, doll-like what he would take her through Tennessee in. It's a shorter dress. At her age at that time, she would have worn a longer dress, but we really wanted it to be sort of, you know, juvenile. Like, again, he's, you know, objectifying her, treating her like a child, you know, horrifically captured her, you know, all those things. And then, and taken her to Tennessee, where then he gives her a new dress, and which is sort of echoes her mother. Her mother has escaped from the same plantation years before and is left in a blue dress. And we made sure that Cora had a blue dress as well. You kind of see that later on in Mabel when you watch it, but we really wanted to. Colson Whitehead wrote a lot of blue, and also, so we wanted to honor that. But we also needed a through line with, you know, Cora and Mabel. And so Ridgway sort of objectifying and treating Cora like a piece of property, almost like, you know, that dress always reminded me of like a piece of china, like a piece of Wedgwood, you know, that he gives her in Tennessee. And when she gets to Indiana, she gets new things there. but as Cora's, what, everything she's been through, she's still, a little bit hesitant to just give into, that she's free, she know. And so her colors are soft and more blend into the environment in Indiana. She still needs to be subtle and sort of blended. She's already, scared of the attention she's causing at the farm. So again, even it's a new place and it's newfound freedom and it's much better than what she was before. She doesn't give into that and doesn't really take advantage of that. There is still distrust, within herself, and with of who she's with and where she is, I suppose. So we just really wanted, it to be natural to that environment as well. So we were really, the map was, Colson Whitehead and Barry and the writers and, it's all, to me, was all there on the page and how, we sort of naturally, and that was, even though the Underground Railroad, we bend time and it is magic realism and it is fantastical and it's this other alternate history there, we are still depicting a truth. We're taking a huge part of American history and showing it you in another way, and also telling you how much it keeps happening and happening and happening and happening still to this day, right now. These same things are still happening. So I wanted to be as truthful as we could in the close, and you should just be, as real as possible. And Barry is a truth seeker. I'm a truth seeker. To me, that's one of the most exciting things that gets achieved in costume design, is when you find those truths and you really can depict clothing that seems very, very real,
Yeah. And
that's one of my favorite things ever when I watch other people's work. It's when I see something that's so truthful and so right on, it's like, that's perfect for what that person's wearing, that's really, you connect with it also in a way that feels much more real too.
Absolutely. And you already mentioned the South Carolina episode several times now, and it's the episode that's been submitted for your Emmy consideration in the period costume category. I guess my first question would be, why did you choose to submit this episode?
It was a big concept of what we did and what we, sort of everything that went behind it. And from the issued clothing that our Black population receives and what they wear, to our background artists and our other characters, and then the horrific museum costumes, then the social, the dance. I think it was the most, it had the most variety of the most variety. It's like it wasn't a straightforward place either. So that was why I think that was chosen.
And I remember watching that episode and being completely stunned by how different it was from the series premiere, not just in terms of story and tone, but in terms of scope, which you've mentioned several times. And you also mentioned the background actors, and I think this episode is a particular spotlight for them. And background actors, the work on them is too often ignored, even though they're so incredibly essential to build the world.
Important.
Yeah,
so important.
Right. And
our background artists all the way through were so important in Indiana, everywhere. The North Carolina, well, they're essential. They're absolutely essential. And you treat everyone like a principal in a period costume piece. Everyone is a principal. Everyone is dressed from head to toe. So, and it really is, our background artists are very, very important. And obviously, if you saw the gays, you see what they brought. We're so grateful for every single person that was in the Underground Railroad.
Absolutely. And I do want to ask about one specific design in this episode, which is the yellow outfit that Tusumbedu wears. Because if I had to think of one costume that came to mind first when I thought of the Underground Railroad, it would probably be that one for some reason. So could you talk me through the idea behind that costume, specifically the use of the color yellow, which really pops?
Right. Yellow, seeing, the optimism of yellow, right? The sunny, beautiful, yellow. It happened naturally with Barry. We had, there are three there, we called that every costume has a name in the Underground Railroad, whether it's Cora's date dress with Royal, her brown plaid date dress, we called it. Yeah, everything kind of had a name, but this was the day dress that was issued to our Black women in South Carolina. And we did it in several other fabrics. We did it in like a cream color, and we did it in another stripe, and we only did it in like 3 colors, 3 or 4. And I had that one. I had the yellow one on the form. It was next to another one that I thought maybe we would do for Cora. And Barry walked into the. We were in a school in Savannah. That's where we prepped, which was amazing because like our seamstress, our cutter fitter had her own shop in a classroom, and then our tailor had his and hers. Well, we had 2. Had their own classroom. They had the biology lab with the ager dyer. Everybody had all these different rooms. It was great. But Barry walked into the classroom of our cutter fitter where our shop was set up, and he was like, "What is that one?" So it naturally just sort of happened. It was perfect kind of for Cora and optimism in South Carolina. There were probably, if you look into the crowds and to our Black community, there's probably a few other women there with that same dress on, because that's all they, it was 3 different fabrics, and here's your choice. And Cora chose the yellow, and I think it helped, sort of sell the idea of optimism in South Carolina. Like, what a difference from that drab running dress to this yellow, beautiful, optimistic dress that she then gets to have in South Carolina. We needed that, sort of jump from Georgia to South Carolina.
Right. And on a final note, what do you feel like you learned from the experience of working on this show, both professionally and perhaps just in general?
Oh gosh, it was really, and I've said it and I sound like a broken record, but it was really one of the biggest, greatest, most valuable, most educational, beautiful, heart-wrenching experiences of my life. And, in those days would get hard. We would say as a team and as a department, we'll never, ever experience what our Black brothers and sisters went through. This is nothing. I mean, making something this big and this many people coming together to build something, and the long days and the worry, the anxiety of serving the story right, and all the things that come with that. Our film life is such a different beast of a life, and it's it's, you're all in you're all in, your whole being is in, but nothing would compare with what our African American brothers and sisters went through. I learned so much, all the way through from the research. That's what's amazing also too about our work, is that you're in different cultures, different periods, different times, different scripts, different stories. It's constantly an education.
Yeah.
And so there were so many things about American history that I wasn't clued into, or just certain things that happened, practices. And, I grew up in the South, and of course knew about plantations and but even learned more, just even more of the our horrific history of what has happened over these 400 years. So it was just very, very educational. And then as far as the creative, as far as the design, as far as everything, I did things that I never thought I would be able to do. I mean, we had such a huge team. We built so much. We built, so 50% of the clothing in the show, we built hats. The aging dyeing process, I learned more, with aging and dyeing. I learned more about millinery. I learned more about construction in 1850s to 1900s clothing. It's just so vast of what we learned and then what we did. And it was it was one of the most incredible experiences of my life. I'll never forget it. Someone asked if it's something you won't forget. It's something I won't ever forget. It'll always be dear, and it'll be dear to my heart, and a huge, educational, valuable, very valuable experience.
Well, that's great. And thank you so much for shedding light on your process. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you for having me so
Yes,
much.
of course. And to our viewers, make sure to check out The Underground Railroad if you haven't already on Amazon Prime Video, and click subscribe before you leave. Thank you so much.
Thank you.